Second part of the demo, we're going to work with our saturation scale and then also mixing our complementary colors. So I've gone ahead and filled in my complementary colors. So I'm going to pick cyan, and then on the other side is going to be my orange. And so we know that these two are opposite on the color wheel. The easiest way I would suggest doing this is starting with your mixed color. So by mixed color, I mean it's not 100% magenta, it's not 100% cyan. I'm not going to start on this side. That gets a little bit complicated. I'm going to start on this side. So I'm going to show you what the swatch looks like. So if I double click, you'll notice that it's 77% magenta and 100% yellow. So I've got my two pure colors on either side. I'm going to click on the one to the left, and I'm going to go ahead and fill it with that color. Once again, I'm going to make a new swatch, and we're going to make some bigger jumps right now. And this is all going to be done visually. So I don't have a set of percentages that you need to follow. Instead, you need to visually kind of think about it. With complementary colors, when we add one into the other, it starts to neutralize it, and it creates a much broader range of types of colors that we can work with. And then, of course, off of this, we could work with tints and shades infinitely. Um, so what I'm going to do is I've got right here is my orange that I'm working with. And now to counterbalance it, I'm going to start adding cyan. And you'll notice immediately that it starts to darken it. So I'll go ahead and say okay, and that's my next step. And you'll have to make bigger steps here. So I'm going to fill it with that color I just mixed. I'm going to make an even bigger jump. Maybe not quite that big. We'll go back. We'll say okay. We're going to fill the next one. And this same principle applies to paint. So the same ideas that we're working with here are things that you would work with when you're working with painting and color mixing in your paints. So acrylic, gouache, watercolor. Watercolor works a little bit differently, but the same idea of kind of like how do you mix more nuanced colors. So I'm going to go and I'm going to try and get all the way over to my cyan. I'll say okay. Now, my cyan is at 100% now. So what I need to do is I need to start taking away from the orange that I've already mixed. So I'm going to go here and I'm going to say new because I can't add any more cyan. So what I'm going to do is equally, I'm going to bring my magenta down and I'm going to start bringing proportionally my yellow slider down too. And I'll say okay. And of course, if we had more boxes, we could certainly have a lot more steps in between, but this is just going to get you kind of in the ballpark. So I'll go ahead and get farther over this way. I'll say okay. And then I'm going to do my last swatch. So now I've got a range. I'll take the magenta all the way out and I'll almost have all the yellow out. And a little bit of magenta right there, and I'll say okay. So now you've got a really nice range between your orange and then also your cyan. What's optically really interesting is you'll notice that visually it looks like the black stroke on this side is a little bit thinner than what's happening over here. And we'll talk a little bit about color optics a little bit later in the semester. So I've got my complementary scale going from my two complementary colors, adding them into each other. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is the saturation scale. So what I'm going to be doing here is I've got down here, I've got my percentage for saturation scale. So we've got our gray value, and then we're going to be adding the hue into that. So the first one is just a pure black. So if I look over here, I've got a 90% black. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to fill it with that 90% black again, and I'm going to start adding my hue into it. So I'm going to say add it to it. And now I'm going to, instead of 0, I'm going to add 25% cyan. I'll say okay. And then here, I'm going to go once again, and I can work off that same one that I just had, and I can say plus. Here I'm going to add 50%, and I'll say okay. And then next, I am going to go to, 50%. Next, I'm going to go to what 75% looks like. And then lastly, I'm going to take a look at what 100% looks like. So even though this looks really subtle, from a color perspective, there are big changes that are happening in each one of these. So as we go from the bottom to the top, the saturation is going to change. And so we're going to do the same thing. I'm not going to walk through all of these, but we'll also really notice that with like the 10%. So if I go to my 10% swatch and I say add, and now I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm going to go to my cyan and use the same color for each one of these. I'm going to say 25% for cyan. And oftentimes when students are working, they're like, I don't know what colors to mix. I don't really know where to start. This is a great way to get you comfortable mixing lots of nuanced colors, making you think about colors that maybe you never thought about before or really considered before. And I'll go ahead and fill this one out. So we'll go to 75 and see what that looks like. And then we'll go here. And you'll notice this isn't a true, I mean, these are tints, but this is not a true, say, just adding the color itself. Having that little bit of black in there does make a difference. So I've got 100%. So this 100% cyan with a little bit of black is very different than this 100% pure cyan. And you'll be able to kind of see the difference as you go through. So as we're finishing our file, of course, you'll have everything filled in. You'll have your saturation scale filled in, you'll have your secondary, tertiary, all of that filled in. The last thing that you need to do is you need to remove the strokes from each one of your boxes, and this is pretty simple to do. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to click and drag so that everything is selected. If I look up here on my control panel, you'll notice it saying, oh my goodness, there are a million swatch colors. Say that's okay. Right here, you'll notice that there's black. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to click here, and I'm going to say no strokes. So what you turn in for me should have no strokes on it because the black affects how we perceive color. So I'm going to go here to my tints. I'm going to say no stroke. I'm going to turn that off. And this way it'll also be able to see kind of how your colors are working and how those color relationships are happening a little bit easier when they're sitting right next to each other than having a black or white line between them. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to select all of these. I'm going to take the stroke off of all of these. So when you turn in your file, it should look exactly like this. So no strokes, you should have your name written correctly up here. You should have everything filled out the way that I demoed it. You should have everything kind of organized, neat, and labeled. You should leave all of that. And the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hit save. I'm going to save my final version. Actually, I'll save this one. And the next thing that I want to do is I'm going to go to File, and I'm going to export it. And I'm going to say Export As. And do not turn in your Illustrator file. If you do that, I will not accept it. You need to turn in a JPEG. So export, make sure that you do last name first, and we'll call it Color Wheel. And save it somewhere where you'll remember it. Make sure that you say use artboards in case something is kind of floating around out here that you needed. You're going to say export. Your color model, what we're going to do is we're going to change it to RGB. We're going to have a good quality size file. Resolution should be medium, 150 pixels per inch. You don't need to worry about anything else. And then we'll go ahead and say OK. And that JPEG is the file that you will upload to Canvas. So you'll have something like this that I'll take a look at. So if any of your colors, if you're looking at them and you're going back and you're like, oh, that's too big of a jump between those two, go back in and hand correct that. All of your swatches are completely customizable. This is really teaching you how to kind of see the subtle differences between things. So saving that JPEG file, uploading it to Canvas, and then you'll be finished with this part of your project.